I did not find out my wife was cheating the way people usually do. There was no lipstick on a collar, no late-night confession, no hotel receipt falling out of a pocket. What I found was worse because it was clean, organized, and written like a checklist. I was standing in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning, half awake, coffee going cold on the counter, when her tablet lit up on the island with a notification she forgot to silence. I was not snooping. I was not suspicious yet. I just saw my own name at the top of the screen, followed by bullet points, timestamps, and notes about my behavior written with clinical precision. Heart rate elevated after confrontation. Avoid reassurance tonight. Increase uncertainty window. Proceed to next phase if the subject remains compliant. For a few seconds my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing, because the words did not fit into any normal version of marriage, betrayal, or even reality. I stood there rereading the same lines again and again, hoping context would magically appear and make it make sense. But the more I read, the colder I felt. This was not a message from a lover. This was not flirtation or planning a hookup. This was documentation, observation. My reactions, my moods, my words were being recorded like data points. And the worst part was that the instructions were clearly being followed in real time because I recognized the last entry. It described a fight we had 2 nights earlier, almost word for word, including how long I stayed silent afterward. My wife, Emily, had been in the shower the entire time. The water was still running. Steam was curling down the hallway. I remember thinking how surreal it was that she could be humming, relaxed, while something that felt like my entire life collapsing sat glowing quietly on her screen. We had been married 7 years, together for 10. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. No kids yet, but we talked about it. We had routines. We had inside jokes. We had a life that looked boring and safe in the way people are supposed to want. I had never once thought I was being studied inside my own home. I locked the tablet without opening anything else and put it back exactly where it was. My hands were shaking, but my face felt completely numb. I did not confront her. I did not ask questions. I finished my coffee like a machine, grabbed my keys, and went to work as if nothing had happened. The entire drive I kept replaying that screen in my head, trying to force it into some harmless explanation. Maybe it was for a class. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I had misunderstood. But the word subject kept echoing louder every time I tried to rationalize it. You do not call your husband a subject unless you have already stopped seeing him as a person. By the end of that day, I knew something else was wrong. Emily texted me less than usual. When she did, her messages were short and neutral, like she was pacing herself. When I got home that evening, she watched me with a subtle focus I had never noticed before, like she was checking whether I matched an expectation she already had. I said something casual about my day and saw relief flicker across her face for half a second, as if I had passed a test without knowing there was one. That was the moment the fear really set in. Whatever I had stumbled into, it had been going on longer than I realized. That night she told me she was going out with friends, something she had started doing more often in the past few months. I nodded and said okay, because that was the version of me she seemed to expect. The front door closed behind her and the house went silent. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall, realizing that for the first time in my adult life, I did not know who I was married to, and worse, I was not sure I had ever been more than a variable in someone else's experiment. After that night, I stopped reacting the way I normally would, not because I was calm or evolved, but because something primal kicked in. I realized very quickly that whatever Emily was doing depended on my predictability. The tablet notes made that clear. My anger, my confusion, my need for reassurance were not emotions to her anymore. They were inputs. So I did the opposite of what my instincts wanted. I became quiet, polite, observant. I watched myself the way she was watching me, measuring every word before it left my mouth, wondering how it would be interpreted, logged, or used against me later. The more neutral I became, the stranger she acted. She would start small conflicts and then pull back at the exact moment I was about to engage. She would disappear for hours with vague explanations that felt intentionally incomplete. When I asked questions, she answered just enough to keep me unsettled, but not enough to provoke a real confrontation. I could almost feel the structure of it, like a maze designed to keep me moving without ever letting me see the whole shape. It was emotional pressure applied with restraint, and that terrified me more than open hostility ever could. A week later, I confirmed what I had been avoiding. She was cheating. Not accidentally, not impulsively, not emotionally. Deliberately. I followed her one evening after she said she was meeting a coworker for drinks. I hated myself for doing it, hated how small it made me feel, but I needed to know whether the betrayal was real or just another layer of manipulation. I parked across the street from a hotel I recognized instantly because it was the kind of place people chose when they did not want to be recognized. I watched her walk in with a man I had never seen before, her posture relaxed, her smile controlled. There was no affection, no excitement. It looked rehearsed. Sitting there in my car, I felt something crack in me that never fully healed afterward. Not because she was with another man, but because it finally clicked that the affair itself was a tool. Whatever this program was, whoever was on the other side of those instructions, my pain was part of the process. My jealousy, my insecurity, my silence afterward, all of it had value to someone. I was not just being hurt, I was being calibrated. The pressure started increasing after that. Emily began subtly pushing me into emotional corners. She would accuse me of being distant, then withdraw when I tried to explain. She would praise me for staying calm during arguments, then escalate them the next time to see if I would break. It felt like she was adjusting variables, testing thresholds, searching for a limit. I started sleeping poorly, constantly alert, constantly second-guessing myself. Every reaction felt dangerous. Every silence felt intentional. I could not tell anymore where my real feelings ended and the performance began. Then came the first direct obstacle. Someone else knew. One afternoon, I received an email at work from an address I did not recognize. It was short, professional, and unsettling. "We are aware you have observed irregular behavior. Please do not interfere. Continued cooperation ensures minimal impact." There was no threat in the wording, but the implication was clear. This was not just Emily. This was organized. And they were watching more than just her. That was the moment the situation stopped being about my marriage and started feeling like something much bigger and much darker. I was no longer dealing with betrayal alone. I was dealing with a system that had already decided who I was and how I would respond. And every day I stayed silent. Every night I pretended not to know. I was feeding it exactly what it wanted. The email stayed in my head for days like a low electrical hum. Then small things started happening. A meeting on my work calendar shifted to a different time, and no one claimed they changed it. A routine employment verification alert I had never triggered appeared and disappeared the same day. Nothing overt. Nothing provable. Just enough to let me know the message had landed. I started looking backward instead of forward. Not at Emily, not at her behavior, but at the timeline. When did this start? What changed first? The answer was subtle and easy to miss. About a year earlier, she had taken a short consulting contract through a private research group affiliated with a behavioral science lab in Chicago. She had told me it was data analysis, remote work, nothing personal. At the time, I had barely paid attention because it sounded boring and temporary. Now it felt like the hinge everything had turned on. That was when the late nights started. That was when the language between us shifted. That was when affection became more structured, more deliberate, like it was being deployed instead of felt. I dug carefully. No dramatic hacking, no illegal access. Just public records, academic papers, funding disclosures, and the kind of digital footprint people leave when they assume no one is looking too closely. The program was real, though buried under layers of vague language. It was not a government project or some shadowy intelligence operation. It was a privately funded pilot, stitched together from grants, corporate partnerships, and academic ambition, powerful enough to exist, fragile enough to collapse if exposed. Adaptive stress response mapping, longitudinal intimate environment testing, real-world subject immersion. The phrasing was cold and sanitized, but the intent was obvious. They were studying how people responded to prolonged emotional instability when the source came from a trusted partner. Not in a lab, not in simulations, in real marriages. The discovery that finally tipped everything over came from an unexpected place. A woman named Rachel reached out to me through a professional networking site, framing it as a casual question about a mutual contact. We did not know each other, but she knew Emily, or at least she knew the version of Emily assigned to the program. Rachel had been involved for 6 months before she quit, not as a subject but as a facilitator. Her job had been to monitor compliance, flag deviations, and provide corrective guidance. In simpler terms, she helped people like my wife stay on script. She did not apologize. She did not justify herself either. She simply told me she could not keep pretending it was ethical after watching what it did to people over time. She said the program justified itself by claiming long-term benefits for relationship counseling, conflict resolution training, even military family resilience studies. But what it really produced was breakdown, anxiety, dissociation, identity erosion. Subjects began questioning their own instincts, their own memories, their own worth, which, from a data standpoint, made it incredibly rich. By the time she contacted me, she had already lost her position. No reference, no future in the field. She was not reaching out to save me. She was trying to justify what it had cost her. Talking to me was the only way she could prove to herself that leaving had meant something. Rachel confirmed what I already suspected. The affair was designed. The man was selected. The location was chosen for maximum ambiguity. The goal was not to destroy the marriage outright, but to stretch it to the point where my internal coping mechanisms would reveal patterns. Stay calm versus confront. Withdraw versus pursue. Self-blame versus externalization. Every choice I made fed a model, and I was performing better than expected. That night I sat alone in my car long after getting home. Engine off, lights dark, realizing that for months I had been trying to survive something that was never meant to end. There was no finish line where Emily would suddenly stop and come back to me. There was only escalation until I broke or adapted into someone unrecognizable. But for the first time since this started, I had something they did not expect. I was no longer blind. And more importantly, I was no longer alone. Once you see the full shape of the trap, you stop panicking and start calculating. Fear burns energy fast. Clarity does not. I stopped thinking about what Emily felt, because at that point it no longer mattered. Whether she believed in the program, needed the money, or had convinced herself it was harmless research was irrelevant. What mattered was that every interaction between us was now a controlled environment, and I was still inside it. Walking away immediately would have given them exactly what they wanted. A clean failure state, emotional collapse, data confirmed, case closed. So I stayed, but I stopped being authentic. I became deliberate in a way I had never been before. I let my reactions flatten out just enough to look natural but inconsistent enough to confuse the pattern they were mapping. I introduced noise. I responded warmly to coldness and detached myself from moments designed to provoke vulnerability. I started changing routines in small ways that could not be attributed to suspicion. Different commute times, different sleep patterns. I spoke less about my inner state and more about neutral external topics. I could feel Emily struggling to recalibrate. Her prompts became sharper, her questions more direct. The structure started leaking through the cracks. This was the phase Rachel said most subjects broke. Then came the push. One night she told me she was thinking about leaving. Not angrily, calmly, observationally, like she was reading from a script she had already rehearsed. In that moment I understood this was the stress peak. The final escalation designed to force a decisive emotional response. Begging, rage, despair, anything raw enough to finish the model. I looked at her and felt something I had not felt in months. Not love, not hate, distance. I told her I understood. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. She stared at me, searching for something. Fear maybe, hurt, resistance. When she did not find it, she excused herself to the bedroom. I stayed on the couch, heart racing, knowing the program was now scrambling. An unpredictable subject was worse than a broken one. 2 days later Rachel called me. Not messaged, called. She said the system had flagged my recent behavior as anomalous. They were accelerating termination protocols. Rachel explained that termination did not mean containment. It meant cleanup, NDAs, phone calls that never got written down, data burial, making the experiment disappear before anyone outside the system asked the wrong questions. That meant one of two things. Either Emily would suddenly confess everything and frame it as a misguided mistake, or they would provoke a hard break designed to extract one last clean reaction. Rachel told me there was a window, short, risky, but real. The data lived on a mirrored server. Not just notes, audio samples, emotional scoring, predictive models, proof. If it surfaced publicly, the program would be dead. Careers destroyed, lawsuits everywhere. But it would also expose every subject involved, including me, including Emily. There would be no quiet ending. No privacy, no undoing the damage. That night I sat at my desk staring at the dark reflection of my own face in the monitor, realizing the choice was not about revenge. It was about identity. If I destroyed them, I would reclaim the narrative at the cost of burning everything down. If I stayed silent, I would survive intact on the outside but carry the knowledge that people like me would continue to be used, measured, and discarded quietly. Emily came home late. She looked tired in a way I had never seen before. Not the exhaustion of guilt, but the fatigue of someone who had been performing precision for too long without believing in it anymore. Just exhausted. For a moment I almost asked her why. Almost gave her a chance to be human again. But then I remembered the checklists, the phases, the word subject. I did not sleep that night. By morning, the decision had already been made. I did not expose them. I also did not forgive them. What I did instead was quieter, slower, and harder to explain to anyone who has never been reduced to a line of data. I took the evidence Rachel secured and locked it away, not as leverage, not as a threat, but as an anchor. Proof that what happened was real. Proof that I was not imagining the manipulation, the erosion, the way my sense of self had been slowly softened and reshaped to fit someone else's model. Knowing I could burn it all down at any moment gave me something I had not felt in a long time. Agency. Emily noticed the shift before I ever said anything. She always did. The difference now was that she could no longer read me. I stopped performing entirely. Not as resistance, as absence. I moved through the house like a guest finishing a long stay. I handled logistics. I stayed polite. I slept in the spare room without drama. When she tried to restart old patterns, tenderness followed by distance, guilt followed by reassurance, nothing landed. There was no surface left to push against. A week later, she told me the program was ending. Not confessed. Announced. She said the funding had been pulled, that the research group was dissolving quietly, that everyone involved had been advised to move on and not discuss it further. She said she was relieved. She said she wanted us to rebuild. She said all the right words in the wrong order. I told her I already knew. That was the only moment she truly broke. Not theatrically. No collapse. Just a visible unraveling as the version of me she had been trained to manage disappeared completely. She tried to explain without excuses. She tried to apologize without defending herself. I listened without reacting. When she finished, I told her something that surprised both of us. I said the marriage ended the moment I stopped being a person to her. We separated quietly. No public scandal. No dramatic confrontation. Friends got a simplified version that fit neatly into conversation. We grew apart. We wanted different things. It happens. The truth lived elsewhere, heavier and sharper than anything I could compress into small talk. Emily moved out within a month. I stayed. The house felt empty at first, then neutral, then finally mine again. Rachel disappeared from my life shortly after. No goodbyes, no updates, just silence. Maybe that was her way of atoning. Maybe it was self-preservation. I did not chase it. Sometimes I think about releasing the data anyway. About what would happen if I let the world see how easily intimacy can be weaponized when ethics bend under funding and ambition. Other times I wonder if keeping it hidden is the last boundary I get to set. Not for them. For me. What I know now is this. Betrayal hurts. But being studied without consent changes you in a deeper way. It teaches you how fragile identity becomes when someone else is rewarded for breaking it down. I am rebuilding slowly, not into who I was before, into someone less predictable, less available, more intentional. Sometimes I imagine what would happen if I released it all. Not hypothetically, practically. Names, audio, models, proof. And I always stop at the same question. And if there is a moral here, it is not about trust or marriage or even love. It is about vigilance. About remembering that the most dangerous experiments are the ones that look like ordinary life, and that sometimes the only way to win is not to expose the system or play it better, but to step out of it entirely, carrying the truth quietly, like a scar you no longer hide but no longer let define you either. If you had the proof and the power to end it forever, would you expose them, or would you walk away and protect yourself instead? Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories like this are coming.